when work was the only way to live. This story does not begin by claiming who worked harder than whom. It begins with a far harsher historical reality. In the history of black people, labor was not a personal choice, not a path to demonstrate morality or character, but the minimum condition for survival. When life itself is bound to the ability to work, the concept of choice nearly disappears. For centuries, millions of black people were violently taken from their homelands. They did not leave in search of new opportunities. They did not depart driven by dreams or aspirations. They were forced to abandon their land, their families, and the entire cultural foundations that had sustained them. When they arrived in unfamiliar lands, they were not asked who they wished to become, nor were they given any choice over the work they would do. The only thing awaiting them was labor, and that labor began immediately. White cotton fields stretched endlessly to the horizon. Sugar, tobacco, and coffee plantations followed one another without pause. The space was vast, yet human life was reduced to repetitive tasks carried out day after day. Work began before sunrise and ended only when darkness fell. Time was not measured in rest or private moments, but in unbroken hours of labor. There were no days off, no right to refuse, and no alternative paths. In such conditions, labor carried no meaning of building a future or improving one's life. It was not a road to advancement, nor a means of recognition. Labor was simply the only way to survive another day. Black people were not paid in any true sense, nor did they own the fruits of their own work. Their bodies were treated as tools of production, their strength extracted to exhaustion, and their human value reduced to productivity and yield. Labor in this context was not seen as effort or contribution. It was treated as an unquestioned obligation, something that could be forced without explanation. From this, a historical paradox slowly emerged. People who were subjected to relentless labor under some of the harshest conditions history has ever known were later labeled as lazy. A paradox that can exist only when history is fragmented and context is forgotten. During slavery, there was no room for simple moral categories like diligence or laziness. There was only labor or non-existence, only continued work or death. Black people were not permitted to stop, had no right to refuse labor, and were never offered an easier path. They worked because working was the only way to keep breathing, to stay alive, and to continue existing within a system that offered no alternatives. Therefore, when looking back at this period of history, the right question is not whether black people were hardworking or not. The real question is what circumstances they were placed in when labor became a condition for survival. Only by understanding that can we view history with fairness, not through simplistic labels, but through a deeper understanding of people, their circumstances, and what they were forced to endure. And it is from this foundation that the story of labor, value, and human dignity can finally be seen with honesty. When slavery officially ended, many believed that the burden of labor placed on black people would disappear along with it. But history does not move in simple straight lines. Freedom on paper does not automatically become freedom in daily life, and the removal of one form of oppression does not erase the entire structure built around it. Black people emerged from slavery without land, without property, without social protection, and with almost no real ability to choose a different path for their lives. In this reality, they were no longer forced to work through open violence as before, but they were pushed into the kinds of jobs society depended on, and few others were willing to take. Labor remained the near only means of survival. differing mainly in that it was now labeled voluntary within a system where meaningful choices were extremely limited. Over generations, the hardest, most dangerous, and least acknowledged forms of work became spaces where black labor was concentrated. Railroad lines stretching across continents were built with human strength, sweat, and countless lost lives. Black workers labored under brutal conditions, in scorching heat and freezing cold, breaking stone, laying tracks, hauling heavy sleepers. Accidents were frequent, yet the names of those who fell were rarely recorded. The structures became symbols of progress, while the people who built them faded into silence. Deep underground in mines, black workers descended daily into spaces with little light, heavy air, and constant danger. There, a single mistake could mean death. Coal, metals, and minerals were pulled to the surface to fuel industrial growth, while the human cost remained largely absent from stories of prosperity and expansion. At seaports, they carried massive cargo loads, repeating exhausting motions that slowly wore down their bodies over years. Calloused hands and bent backs never appeared in economic reports. Yet, entire supply chains depended directly on this unseen labor. In factories and on construction sites, black workers continued operating loud, dangerous machinery, enduring long shifts, low wages, and harsh conditions. Alongside physically demanding labor, black people were also funneled into occupations society labeled as low status or easily overlooked. Cleaning, waste collection, behind-the-scenes service work, jobs rarely noticed, yet without them, urban life would quickly collapse. These jobs did not disappear with time. They persisted, and black workers were often the ones who continued carrying them across generations. Over time, the long presence of black people in these roles became deeply misinterpreted. Instead of being understood as the result of history and social structure, it was reframed as a matter of personal choice or lack of effort to rise. This perspective ignores a critical reality. When access to education, capital, and social networks is not distributed fairly, labor outcomes cannot fully reflect human ability or potential. When a community is placed into the same categories of work for generations, the issue is no longer individual. It is systemic. Black people performed the labor that kept society functioning. Yet their work was rarely described as a contribution. It was treated as expected, as endlessly available, as easily replaceable. This invisibility diminished the value of the work itself and reduced the people behind it to mere components rather than individuals with dignity. If we look back honestly, no city was built without this labor, and no economy functioned without these hands. Black workers were present in the most difficult places and at the moments society needed labor the most, during wars, during crises, and when the hardest tasks had to be done immediately. Yet they were still too often viewed through the lens of prejudice, rather than recognized as people who carried the heaviest share of work in modern history. When hard work is not a trait, but a consequence of circumstance. After centuries of forced labor and physically demanding work that was never freely chosen, society gradually formed an oversimplified view of black people. Instead of examining historical conditions, social structures, and the limitations they were forced to live within, many people turned the outcomes of those circumstances into judgments about human nature itself. From there, concepts like hard-working or lazy began to function as labels rather than as honest descriptions of human lives. In reality, modern social science shows that hard work is not an innate trait tied to skin color or origin. It is shaped by living conditions, access to education, economic opportunity, and social security. When a person lives in circumstances where survival depends directly on labor, they are compelled to work more. When a community is kept in a state of constant insecurity, it has no luxury to rest or experiment with alternative paths. The history of Black people illustrates this clearly. Across generations, they lived within systems where labor was not simply a means of earning a living, but a requirement for existence within society. From slavery through post-slavery eras, work remained inseparable from survival. In such conditions, hard work was not a moral choice, but a natural response to staying alive. However, when viewed without context, society often interpreted this reality in the opposite way. As Black people became concentrated in physically demanding and manual jobs, some concluded this was due to a lack of ability or a lack of effort to rise. This line of reasoning ignores a fundamental truth. When access to education, capital, and social networks is unequal, labor outcomes cannot accurately reflect human potential or capacity. Many studies show that when living conditions and opportunities are equalized, differences in effort or achievement between groups largely disappear. This suggests that what is often called character is frequently the result of long-standing circumstances rather than inherent qualities. When a community is compelled to work continuously in undervalued roles, society not only exploits its labor, but also constructs a distorted image of the people themselves. The danger of prejudice lies in its ability to make injustice appear reasonable. When people believe a group is naturally that way, they feel no urgency to change systems or question inequality. Bias becomes a means of avoiding collective responsibility. In the case of Black people, assumptions about hard work or laziness have repeatedly been used to justify the continuation of deep-rooted inequalities. History, when examined honestly, tells a different story. No community could survive centuries of harsh labor, restricted rights, and limited opportunity without resilience, discipline, and a high capacity for adaptation. The continued existence of Black people, their ability to build families, communities, and cultures under extreme conditions, is evidence of human endurance and will, not of any innate trait. So when we ask questions about hard work, perhaps the question itself needs to change. Instead of asking whether a group is hardworking or not, we should ask what conditions they were forced to live under and what they had to do to survive within those conditions. Only when the question is framed correctly can the answer carry real meaning. Seen this way, Black labor is no longer a characteristic to compare or judge. It becomes part of a broader human story about people and circumstance. A story that reminds us human behavior cannot be separated from the social environment in which it occurs, and that human value should never be measured by simple labels, but by a deep understanding of history, opportunity, and the limits people are forced to navigate. When looking back at this entire historical journey, one thing gradually becomes clear. The story of Black labor is not a story of comparison, nor is it a story meant to praise or justify. It is a story about how people were placed into specific circumstances and how they were forced to adapt in order to survive. In this context, labor is no longer a moral concept, but a matter of survival deeply tied to history itself. For centuries, society has grown accustomed to seeing Black people in the most physically demanding, dangerous, and least recognized forms of work. That repetition has led many to mistakenly believe these roles were their natural place in society. History shows otherwise. No position is natural when it is created through violence, exclusion, and long-standing systems of inequality. These jobs do not reflect the value or ability of the people performing them, but rather the structure of a society that has unevenly distributed opportunity. When the labor of a group is treated as something taken for granted, society loses more than fairness. It loses the ability to see the human beings behind the work. In many periods of history, Black people were not recognized as individuals with dreams, intellect, and emotions, but as hands, bodies, and resources to be exploited. This process of dehumanization obscured a simple truth. They were people who were living, enduring, and struggling to preserve their dignity. Yet, history also reveals something else. Even under the harshest conditions, Black people did more than survive. They built families, communities, and cultures of their own. They created music, language, belief systems, and social bonds that helped them endure pain and loss. This reminds us that labor was never the sum of who they were, and endurance was never the end of their story. As modern societies continue to confront questions of inequality, discrimination, and human value, revisiting the history of Black labor becomes especially important. Not to remain trapped in the past, but to understand that today's injustices did not arise by chance. They are the result of structures built long ago, and they can only be changed when we are willing to face their origins honestly. When placed within this context, the question of whether Black people are hard-working begins to lose its meaning. It is a flawed question because it attempts to compress a complex history into a single trait. The more meaningful question is this: what conditions did society create? And how did those conditions force people to live and work in particular ways? When the question changes, so does the perspective. Black labor is no longer evidence to be judged or measured, but a reminder of shared social responsibility. A responsibility to see people fully, not only through the work they perform, but through the history, circumstances, and constraints they have been forced to navigate. At this point, the story does not ask for pity, nor does it seek praise. It simply invites an honest reflection. A reflection on how history has been told, on how certain assumptions have been repeated, and on how we, in the present, either continue or challenge those patterns. In the end, when we set aside simplistic labels and misguided questions, one deeply human truth remains. No one is born to become a symbol of labor or endurance. Every person has value beyond the work they perform. And only when society learns to recognize the truth can the story of labor, history, and humanity truly come to a just conclusion.